Elena Ceresi didn't flinch, not even when the entire second floor of Il Falco went dead silent, waiting to see what the man at the corner table would do to her. She was 27, working a double she couldn't afford to lose. And she'd been sent upstairs that night because she was the only server there who couldn't say no. Everyone who worked that room knew what the corner table meant. One night a year, the second floor closed to the public, and Dario Marchetti sat down alone with an empty chair across from him that nobody was allowed to touch. He was 39. He ran one of the last real families in New York, and in 11 years nobody had ever heard him raise his voice, because he'd never once needed to. That night he spoke nothing but Italian. He sent 2 dishes back without a word of explanation. His cousin laughed and said something in Italian about the girl shaking, about how she didn't understand a single word of it. Dario didn't even look up. "She's nobody," he said, in his own language. "Pour it and disappear." And that was the moment Elena Ceresi stopped being nobody. She set the bottle down on the linen without pouring it, looked the most feared man in that building straight in the eye, and answered him in flawless Italian. 4 words, quiet enough that only half the room heard her, steady enough that every one of them would repeat it by morning. "Sei stanco di vivere? Are you tired of living?" For 3 full seconds, not one person in that room breathed. And then Dario Marchetti did something nobody there expected. Least of all, Elena. If those 3 seconds just made you sit up straight, hit that like button. It really does help stories like hers reach more people. Share it with someone who'd appreciate a woman who refuses to stay quiet. And subscribe, so you don't lose her halfway through. Now, let's go back to that dining room, and to the 3 seconds that changed everything. The 3rd second passed, and Dario Marchetti still didn't move. That was what sent a chill through the entire room. Everyone had braced themselves for the sound of a glass shattering, for a hand sweeping something from the table, for someone being dragged down the stairs. Nothing happened. He sat perfectly still, both hands resting on the tabletop, and stared at the waitress standing less than 3 feet away as though he had just heard a sound he thought he'd forgotten how to hear. Then he spoke, very softly, still in Italian. "Ripetillo. Say it again." Elena Ceresi drew in a breath. She could feel the full weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders in that moment. The 5 men at the table, the 2 more standing at the entrance, and a future in which every road led to her having no job by morning. "Preferirei di no," she replied. "I'd rather not." Then she added in English, so everyone else in the room could hear, that she wanted to keep her job, and if she wanted to keep it, the wisest thing she could do was not say it again. A quiet laugh came from somewhere behind her. The laugh of someone who didn't understand what was happening and thought it was all some kind of amusement. It died very quickly. Dario didn't laugh. He didn't take his eyes off her. "Then tell me why," he said. Elena placed her hand on the neck of the bottle. "Because the seal around this cork has been cut," she said, then glued back together. "Whoever did it was fairly skillful, and if you picked it up in a dim room, you wouldn't notice. But under the light, you can see it." Silvio Ranieri set down his glass and let out a strained laugh, the kind of laugh made by a man trying to pull the entire table back under his control. "This girl is trying to make herself seem important," he said. "She's watched too many movies." Dario raised one finger, just one finger, without lifting the rest of his hand from the table. Silvio fell silent in the middle of his sentence, and the silence that followed told the room more than any words could have. "Who gave you this bottle?" Dario asked. "A man in the storage corridor," Elena said. "He was wearing a server's uniform. I've never seen him before, and I've worked here for 11 months. He handed me the bottle, then walked straight out through the staff door instead of going back to the kitchen." "Why didn't you stop him?" "Because I hadn't examined the seal closely yet," she said. "I only took a careful look after I reached the stairs." "And what did you do after you looked?" Elena answered in the voice of someone reading from a written account, adding no emotion to it. "At 8:42, I reported it to the shift supervisor at the drink preparation station, and I was told I wasn't qualified to lecture anyone about wine. At 8:48, I reported it a second time, at the foot of the stairs, and I was told to bring it up immediately. At 8:51, I went down to the kitchen to find the floor manager, but she was tied up with an incident in the dishwashing area. At 5 minutes to 9, I brought the bottle upstairs. And you didn't pour it?" "No," she said. "I didn't pour it." The entire table went silent. At the top of the stairs, Rosa Vitali stood with her hands clasped in front of her stomach, neither stepping forward nor retreating, and she saw something she would think about for many nights to come. The corner of the mouth of the man at the corner table moved once, very quickly, and then went still. It wasn't a smile. It was something smaller and far more difficult to name. "You understand that you've just accused someone inside this restaurant?" Dario said. "I'm not accusing anyone," Elena replied. "I'm only telling you what I saw and what I did. I don't know who did it, and I have no way of knowing." She pushed the wine bottle toward the center of the table, turned its neck toward him, and spoke her final words in the calmest voice she could still summon. "You don't have to believe me. You only have to look." Dario Marchetti stared at the bottle for a long time before touching it. Then he picked it up, without haste, and turned the neck beneath the low-hanging lamp directly above the table. No one spoke. The man seated beside Silvio leaned forward slightly, then straightened again. Marco Bellini, who had remained silent throughout the meal, took off his glasses and then put them back on, and then every one of them saw it. A fine cut ran across the seal, thin as a strand of hair, carefully pressed back into place, but not carefully enough, and at one corner the paper had wrinkled slightly where it had been glued down a second time. Dario lowered the bottle onto the tabletop with extraordinary gentleness, more gently than an ordinary person would set down a glass. Then he raised his head and looked around his own table, slowly, one man at a time, and during those 3 seconds, not one of them dared meet his eyes. "Nico," he called. The man standing at the entrance stepped forward. "Close the door," Dario said. "No one leaves this floor." It took Nico Sardo 17 minutes to bring back an answer. He came up by the stairs, stopped at the head of the table, and spoke just loudly enough for the people seated there to hear. There were 19 people on the shift roster that night. He had checked every one of them against the restaurant's employee records. None matched the waitress's description, and none had been assigned to carry wine from the cellar to the second floor. The 20th person didn't exist. Dario didn't ask him to repeat himself. He simply waited. "The camera at the staff entrance," Nico continued, "has a blank stretch of exactly 6 minutes, from 8:33 to 8:39. It wasn't a signal failure. Someone placed something over the lens and then removed it. The recording server kept running the entire time. There's simply nothing there for those 6 minutes." Elena remained exactly where she had been standing. No one had told her to leave, and she was clear-headed enough to understand that walking out of the room on her own would now be more dangerous than staying. She heard the words 6 minutes and did the subtraction in her head. The camera had been covered 9 minutes before she received the bottle. That meant this hadn't been improvised. It meant someone had known in advance who would be seated at which table that night, what each person would drink, and when the wine would be brought upstairs. Silvio Ranieri pushed his chair back and rose. "Let me handle it," he said, his voice once again carrying its familiar composure. "I'll have my people review the restaurant's entire staff tonight, and I'll take this bottle to be tested. You don't need to concern yourself with it." Dario looked up. He didn't say no. He merely held his cousin's gaze 1 beat longer than necessary, then turned to Nico. "You take it," he said. "You, and no one else. And I want to hear the results from your own mouth." Silvio remained standing for another second, then sat down and smiled as though that were exactly what he had just proposed. But Rosa Vitali, still standing at the top of the stairs, saw that the smile came a little later than it normally would have. Nico took a clean napkin, wrapped the wine bottle from neck to base, and no one in the room spoke the word they were all thinking. There was no need. It was already there in the way he held the bottle, as if he were carrying something that could shatter and kill at the same time. Then Dario said, "Bring the shift supervisor up here." Brad Kessler climbed the stairs wearing the expression of a man who still believed he was being summoned to receive praise. That expression lasted for about 4 seconds. "Tell it again," Dario said to Elena. "From the beginning," Elena told them. She didn't look at Brad, didn't raise her voice, and didn't add a single adjective. She recited exactly what had happened, as though reading from a formal statement. "At 8:42, at the drink preparation station, I said the seal had been cut, and the answer I received was that I wasn't qualified to lecture anyone about wine. At 8:48, at the foot of the stairs, I said it a second time, and the answer was that I should bring it upstairs immediately. At 8:51, I went down to the kitchen to find the floor manager, but I couldn't reach her. At 5 minutes to 9, I brought the bottle upstairs." When she finished, she fell silent. She didn't add that if Brad had listened to her, the night would have ended differently. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room had already done that arithmetic for themselves. "Is that what happened?" Dario asked. Brad opened his mouth, then closed it again. Then he said the restaurant had been very busy that night, that there had been hundreds of things to handle at once, and that he couldn't remember every exact word. "She remembers," Dario said, "all 3 times, with the time of each." And he said nothing more to Brad Kessler. Not one word of reproach, not one threat. He simply stopped looking in his direction. And to everyone present in that room, it was clearer than any sentence a judge could have handed down. Brad stood there a little longer, waiting to be addressed again, then walked downstairs on his own. Dario Marchetti rose. He fastened the button of his jacket, and as he passed the place where Elena stood, he stopped. "Come si chiama?" he asked. "What is your name?" She looked up. "Elena Soresi," she replied. He gave one very slight nod. "Non lo dimenticherò," he said. "I won't forget it." Then he walked down the stairs and out of the building without looking back, and he didn't offer her a single word of thanks. Elena stood there listening to the sound of the car pulling away from the curb, and realized that only now had her hands begun to tremble. Rosa Vitali came forward, took hold of her elbow, and led her through the kitchen to the back door. She didn't ask whether Elena was all right. She only said, "Don't take your usual route home tonight. Don't wait for the train on your regular platform. And if anyone calls your name on the street, don't turn around." Elena asked why. Rosa said, "Because within the next 12 hours, far more people will know your name than you think." And she was right, only not in any way either of the 2 women standing at that back door that night could possibly have imagined. Elena walked another 3 blocks before taking the train from a different station, and she reached Astoria close to 2 in the morning. Her mother had fallen asleep in the chair in the living room, with her headphones still plugged into the television, the kind of sleep that belonged to someone waiting for her child to come home but not wanting the child to know she had waited. Teresa Soresi was 58 years old. 3 times a week, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, she spent 4 hours at a dialysis center, 15 minutes from their home by car, and every time she returned, it took the whole of the following day before she felt fully conscious again. On the kitchen table lay the stack of papers Elena had arranged by payment deadline rather than by the date they had arrived. Medicare covered 80%. Everyone said that to her as though it were a comfort. No one told her how much the remaining 20% of a year of dialysis came to, added to the monthly supplemental insurance premium, added to the portion of her medication that the prescription plan charged separately, added to all the little expenses that didn't fall into any category at all. And no one helped her calculate the hardest part, which was that 3 times every week, Elena had to trade shifts to take her mother there, and trading shifts meant losing hours meant losing money, and a restaurant wouldn't keep someone forever when that person was always asking for understanding. That was why she worked double shifts. That was why she couldn't say no. She poured herself a glass of water, sat on the edge of the chair, and thought about what she had just done. There had been a time when she'd done exactly the same thing, and paid for it for 3 years. At 24, Elena had been a senior forensic audit specialist at a firm in Manhattan. She was the one who found the discrepancy in the records of a major client, a discrepancy large enough that no one could call it a mistake. She followed procedure. She wrote a report, dated it, and submitted it to her superiors. 3 weeks later, the firm reached a private settlement with the client, and Elena was the one escorted out of the building. They handed her a severance agreement with a confidentiality clause and a non-disparagement clause, and told her very politely that if she signed, everything would come to a quiet and peaceful end. She signed because her father was in the hospital at the time, and she needed that money within the week. 3 months later, that same client sued her for defamation. She won. The next 2 years and every dollar she had ever saved disappeared into legal fees. But the greatest loss wasn't the money. The greatest loss was the agreement she had signed, the thing that kept her from opening her mouth to explain why there was a 3-year gap in her resume, right in the middle of the finest years of her career. At every interview, they asked her the same question, and every time, she had to answer that she couldn't discuss it. No one hired a forensic auditor who couldn't talk. Her father, Tommaso Soresi, would have understood this better than anyone if he'd still been alive. He was born in Naples, came to America at 20, and spent his entire life keeping the books for small shops in Brooklyn, bakeries, shoe repair shops, fish markets, places where the owners trusted only a handwritten ledger and a man who knew how to calculate. On weekends, he worked as a court interpreter. He taught his daughter 2 things. The first was Italian, not the Italian found in books, but the language he'd carried with him from his old neighborhood, taught by making her sit beside him at the kitchen table every evening and translate every sentence from his telephone conversations. The second was something he repeated so often that there had been times when she grew tired of hearing it, that the truth couldn't protect itself, and she had to give it a date. He died 3 years earlier, while she was still fighting the lawsuit, and she had never abandoned the habit he left behind. So that night, even though it was past 2 a.m, and even though she was so tired that her handwriting leaned slightly across the page, Elena still took the notebook from her purse, opened to a blank page, and wrote down everything that had happened on the restaurant's second floor. She recorded the time, every word that had been spoken, and who had spoken it, even the 6-minute stretch during which the camera had shown nothing. She wrote the date at the top of the page, initialed the bottom, then photographed every page with her phone and sent the images to her own email account. She didn't know what she was preparing for. She was only doing what her father had taught her to do. Her mother woke as Elena was closing the notebook and asked, "Did anything unusual happen tonight?" Elena said no. It had only been busier than usual. Teresa looked at her daughter for another second, then told her to go to bed because she still had to drive her mother to dialysis tomorrow. At 7 a.m, the phone vibrated against the tabletop. It was Rosa Vitali. She didn't offer a greeting. She only said, "Get dressed. There's a car waiting for you downstairs." The car carried her out of the city, heading east, and stopped in front of a house in Oyster Bay that couldn't be seen from the road. Elena didn't ask a single question during the entire drive because she knew the driver wouldn't answer and because she was busy doing something else. In her mind, she was already packing the box that would hold her personal belongings. The notebook, the coat hanging in the employee locker, the spare pair of shoes beneath the drawer. She always packed that box in her mind before something was taken from her, because she had learned that preparing in advance made it easier to keep her balance when the moment came. Nico Sarto led her down a long hallway and opened the door to a room at the far end. Dario Marchetti was standing with his back to the door. "Sit down," he said. "I'd prefer to stand," Elena replied, "until I know whether I'm being fired." He turned around. In the daylight, he looked far more tired than he had the night before, and it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that came from losing sleep. "You're not being fired. Then what am I?" He pulled out a chair and didn't answer at once. "You're being reconsidered," he said. Then he placed a thin file on the table and pushed it toward her. Elena didn't need to open it to know what was inside. His people had completed the work in 12 hours, exactly as Rosa had said they would. "You once made a living forcing books to tell the truth," he said. "I did," she replied. "Then I discovered that a person can't survive doing that work honestly." He didn't ask anything more about her past. That was the first thing that made her sit down. He pulled out the chair opposite her and took his seat, resting both hands on the table just as he had the night before. "I'll speak plainly," he said, "because I don't have time, and neither do you. Last night, someone wanted me dead. That person knew which night I would be there, which table I would sit at, and which bottle would be brought upstairs. None of those 3 things appears on any list in the restaurant. Only 4 people knew all 3, and all 4 of them were sitting at the table with me." Elena remained silent. She didn't ask who those 4 people were, because she understood that if she did, the conversation would end. "I have 14 legitimate businesses," he continued. "Restaurants, 2 laundries, a construction company, logistics, and several others. Every one of them keeps books. Every one of them is audited each year, and every one of them is clean on paper. I want you to examine all of them again." He watched her as he spoke without blinking. "Why me?" Elena asked. "Because last night, you were the only person in that building who told me something you knew would cost you your job." She sat still for a moment. Then she said, "I have conditions." He tilted his head slightly. "Tell me." 3 weeks, Elena said. "A room with a lock, and I keep the key. I report only to you, through no one else, not even the person you trust most. And no one is allowed to fire me before I finish, including you. If you want to stop the work before it's done, I'll leave. But you have to tell me yourself, not send someone else to do it." He looked at her for a long time. 5 times what you're earning now," he said. "That isn't necessary," she replied. "Pay me exactly what I make at the restaurant. People aren't accustomed to refusing my money." "I'm not refusing money," Elena said. "I'm refusing the portion I haven't earned. If you pay me 5 times as much today, someone in this house will say you bought me, and they'll be right." She paused for a beat. "What I want is your signature beneath the conditions I just gave you. Money can be taken back. A signature is much harder. Dario Marchetti said nothing through a silence long enough for Elena to think she had gone too far. Then he reached for a sheet of paper, wrote 4 lines in short, straight handwriting, read them through once, and signed his name beneath them. He pushed the page across the table. She read every line slowly, twice, exactly as her father had taught her. Then she initialed the lower right corner and added the date. "No one has ever set conditions with me," he said. "No one has ever asked what my conditions were, sir." Something passed across his face, so swiftly that Elena would have missed it if she had blinked. He stood. "You begin tomorrow morning," he said. "Nico will bring you here and take you home every day." Then he walked toward the door, stopped, and added something whose full meaning she wouldn't understand until much later. "The room I'm giving you to work in belonged to my wife. No one has entered it in 2 years. The following morning, Rosa Vitali was the one who opened the door to the room for her." Elena didn't ask why the floor manager of a Manhattan restaurant was in Oyster Bay at 7 o'clock in the morning, and Rosa offered no explanation. She merely placed the key in Elena's palm, closed Elena's fingers around it, told her she could lock the door from the inside, and left. The room was cold in the particular way of places where no one had breathed for a long time. Elena stood in the middle of it for a while before beginning, not because she was afraid, but because she felt the need to remain still for a moment in a room whose owner was gone. Then she went to work. The records arrived in 4 cardboard boxes, and she spread them across the long table the way her father had once spread the papers from small Brooklyn shops across their kitchen table. 1 column for each business, arranged by year rather than by name, so her eyes could travel straight down without having to remember what she was reading. 14 businesses. 11 years. She didn't read the summaries. Her father had a rule he'd repeated again and again since she was a child, that the total was the number people wrote last, which also made it the easiest one to write incorrectly, and she mustn't trust it until she could rebuild it herself from the smaller parts. So she began from the bottom and worked upward. Receipts first, then daily statements, then weekly statements, and only after that the monthly reports. She read slowly, and she read everything twice, and after the second pass, she recorded in her own notebook whatever the first had failed to reveal. In the middle of the second morning, she opened an old set of reports and found a handwritten note in pencil along the margin of 1 page. The handwriting was small, slanted, and decisive. Someone had circled a number and written 3 words beside it. "Check this again." Elena turned several more pages and found 2 similar notes in 2 other files. She sat motionless for a long time, one finger resting on that pencil mark. Serafina Marchetti had once sat in this very chair, held these very papers, and counted. Elena didn't know that woman, had never seen her face, and had never once heard anyone in this house speak her name aloud. But those 3 penciled words in the margin told her something no one else had. She wasn't the first. Early that afternoon, someone knocked on the door. Silvio Ranieri stood outside with his hands resting loosely in front of his stomach, smiling pleasantly, and said he'd only stopped by to say hello because he'd heard there was someone new in the house. He asked whether she had been given a proper place to sit, enough light, and enough coffee. He said the house was large and easy to get lost in. Then, in precisely the tone a person might use to ask about the weather, he asked whether she had found anything interesting yet. Elena replied that she was still arranging the records by year and that the work would take several days. He nodded and said caution was a good thing, that this family had always valued caution, then wished her a pleasant day and left. Elena rose and locked the door again. Then she opened her private notebook, recorded the date, the time he had arrived, the time he had left, and his question word for word. She added no observation beside it. Her father had taught her that a person should record only what had happened, because speculation could always be added later, but facts would never return once they were gone. Close to 7 o'clock that evening, she opened the records of a laundry in Ozone Park. It was a small business with steady revenue and nothing remarkable about it, and she nearly closed the file. But she had read it a second time, and on that second reading, she added up the original receipts from 1 week in September and compared the total with the amount recorded on the weekly statement. There was a difference of $900. Elena sat perfectly still. $900 from 1 week at a laundry wasn't enough to make anyone rich. It was merely small enough for a busy person to glance at and overlook, and small enough that if anyone questioned it, someone could call it a data entry error. She pulled out a second file, from a different business and a different month, and performed exactly the same calculation. Another discrepancy. She pulled out a third. Another discrepancy. And all 3 times, the amount on the statement was lower than the total of the receipts, never higher. Elena straightened in her chair. Beyond the window, darkness had settled completely, and there wasn't a sound anywhere in the vast house. She reached for the 4th file. Elena worked through that entire night, and nearly all of the following day, and by afternoon, she no longer had to guess. She had finished reconstructing a separate table of her own, written by hand, with 1 business on each row, 1 year in each column, and a negative number in every cell. 40 cash collection points were scattered across the 14 businesses. There wasn't a single exception. There wasn't 1 month, at any location, when the amount entered in the books was greater than the total of the original receipts. She added everything together, and sat staring at the result for a long time. $1,800,000 a year. She was copying that number onto a clean page when the door opened. Dario Marchetti entered, still wearing his overcoat, his car keys in one hand. He stopped just inside the doorway and came no farther, and for 1 second, Elena realized something strange. This man was standing in his own house, yet he looked as though he wasn't certain he had permission to enter that room. "You said 3 weeks," he said. "You've only given me 2 days," Elena replied. "I know." He removed his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and walked around the table to stand beside her. "Show me." She turned her table toward him and placed 1 finger on the first column. "This is the total of the original receipts from 1 week. This is the amount entered in the books for that week. There's a difference of $900. She moved her finger downward. "This is another business. Another month. A difference of $620. This is another business. A difference of $1,100. He bent down to look. She continued, her voice still even. "A little each time. Never enough to make anyone ask questions. Small enough that if someone did ask, it could be called rounding, a data entry error, an employee writing too quickly at the end of a shift." Then she ran her finger down the entire column. "But there's one thing rounding can't do, sir. Rounding has to move both upward and downward. Here, it never moves upward. 40 collection points, 11 years, and not once was more money recorded than was actually received. 1 discrepancy is an error. 40 discrepancies moving in the same direction over 11 years aren't an error anymore. They're a design." Dario didn't answer. He pulled the stack of receipts closer, picked up the pencil from the table, and began adding the figures himself. Elena stepped back half a pace and let him work. He added slowly, without a calculator, writing the numbers in the margin in short, straight strokes, and as she stood watching him, she felt something that had been clenched tightly inside her chest begin to loosen. She had spent 3 years proving to rooms full of people that she knew what she was talking about, and not one of them had ever been willing to pick up a pencil. He finished the calculation. He looked at the final number, then at her table, then asked, "Who keeps these books?" "Mr. Bellini," Elena replied. "Marco Bellini. Every statement passes through his hands before it goes into the annual reports." Dario straightened. "Bellini worked for my father," he said. "I kept him because he'd been there since before I knew how to read a balance sheet." Elena looked down at her table and said, "The first discrepancy I found was in March of the year you took over. Before that, there's nothing." Dario remained silent for a long time. "Your father died in January of that year," Elena continued, her voice softening slightly, and she chose her next words with great care. "He waited until the person in this house who knew how to count better than anyone else was gone." Dario didn't become angry. That was what Elena noticed most about that entire afternoon. He didn't strike the table, didn't utter a curse, and didn't call for anyone. He only stood there staring at the column of figures for a very long time, then said, 11 years is too long to trust a man simply because you've always trusted him." Elena spoke before she had time to consider the words. "You have opinions about your family, sir." The moment she said it, she knew she had crossed a boundary, and she stood still, waiting for the consequences. But he only turned and looked at her. "I have arithmetic about your family," she added more slowly. "Opinions are free." And for the first time since the night at the restaurant, the corner of Dario Marchetti's mouth truly lifted, only slightly and only for a moment, before the expression vanished. "Keep going," he said. He picked up his coat and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. "You said 11 years. Yes. Then there's one more thing you have to tell me," he said. Not how much he took, where the money went. The question of where the money had gone turned out to be something that couldn't be answered in a week. Elena began tracing it, and while she followed the trail, Dario Marchetti appeared at the door of the room every evening. At first, he merely stood there, asked 2 or 3 questions, then left. By the second week, he began to sit. By the third, he stayed for long stretches, and his questions no longer sounded like an interrogation. "Show me how you read this," he said one evening. Elena turned the file toward him. "My father taught me to read from the bottom up," she said. "People write reports from the top down, so if you read them in the direction they were written, you'll follow the path they want you to take. Read them backward, and you'll follow a path of your own." She pushed the stack of receipts toward him. "Start with the smallest one. Add them together. Only then should you look at what they tell you is the total." He did as she said. He made a mistake the first time, overlooking one receipt, and discovered it himself when he checked his work. Elena said nothing. She simply waited. He started adding again from the beginning. There were nights when they sat in silence for hours, one at each end of the long table, neither of them speaking a word, and Elena gradually realized that he wasn't staying because he needed to hear her report. He stayed because this was the only room in the house where the silence didn't weigh upon him. One evening, he asked whether she was afraid of him. She thought for a moment, then said, "I'm afraid of what you can do. I'm not afraid of you." "People tell me I'm ruthless," he said. She looked up at him. "You aren't ruthless," she said. "You're exhausted. Those are 2 different things, sir, and people often confuse them because from a distance, they look exactly the same." He didn't answer through a silence so long that she thought she had said the wrong thing. Then he said, "You're beginning to understand me, Miss Soresi. That's a dangerous habit." "I make my living reading numbers," she replied. "You merely happen to be what all those numbers are attached to." The following night, she worked until 2 o'clock in the morning and fell asleep over the files, one cheek resting against the column of figures she had been adding. She woke near dawn and found his coat draped over her shoulders. He was no longer in the room. Neither of them mentioned it the next day, and she didn't return the coat to him in front of anyone else. At the end of the 3rd week, Bianca Marchetti came home from Colombia for dinner. She was 19, and she entered the study without knocking, looked at the table covered with papers, then asked bluntly, "You're the one reading all my family's books, aren't you?" Elena said yes. Bianca sat on the edge of the table and asked where she had studied accounting, then asked how forensic auditing differed from ordinary accounting, then whether being good at math was all it took to do the work. The girl asked, in the voice of someone who truly wanted to hear the answers, not someone merely trying to be polite. Elena answered each question in turn, and as she did, she realized something that tightened her throat. In this house, Bianca was the first person who had spoken to her as though she were a human being, rather than some useful object that had just been brought home. "Will you teach me how to read a revenue statement?" Bianca asked before leaving. Elena said she would, once her work was finished. That evening, Dario arrived later than usual. He said he wanted to formalize her position, give her a title within the company, an appropriate salary, and a proper contract. Elena set down her pen. "No," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "If you give me a title I haven't earned," she said, "then you'll have turned me into exactly what everyone in this house already thinks I am. An ornament you brought home. And they'll be right, because they'll be able to point to that contract. I'd rather finish the work and let the work speak for me." He looked at her for a moment. "You're the least ornamental person I've ever met," he said. Elena blurted, "Then you clearly haven't met many cash registers." And Dario Marchetti laughed. It was only one sound, brief and hoarse, the sound of something that hadn't been used in a very long time. In the hallway, Rosa Vitali was passing with a stack of towels in her arms, when she suddenly stopped in the middle of the corridor and didn't take another step until the laughter had faded completely, because she hadn't heard that sound in this house for 2 years, and she had begun to believe she would never hear it again. The family dinner was held on Saturday evening, and 3 days before it, Dario told Elena that he wanted her there. She asked what for. He said, "To have dinner." She asked again, "Where will I sit?" He said, "At the table." Elena understood at once that it wasn't an invitation but a declaration, and she also understood that everyone seated at that table that night would take it exactly the same way. 11 people sat down to dinner that evening. She was placed 3 seats away from him, between Nico Sarto and an elderly man she had never met. Throughout the first course, No one said anything to her beyond a few polite greetings, and Elena ate slowly, listened carefully, and didn't speak first. Halfway through the second course, Cordelia Ranieri set down her glass. Cordelia was the oldest person at the table, with a soft voice and the manner of someone accustomed to being heard without ever having to raise it. "Miss Cerezi," she said, "there's something I'm curious about. How does a girl who carries plates make herself indispensable to my nephew so quickly? That truly is a talent." The entire table fell silent. It wasn't an awkward silence, but the silence of people waiting to see in which direction the blood would flow. Elena set down her fork. $1,800,000 a year, she said. Cordelia tilted her head slightly. "That's the amount that has been underreported in your family's books every year for the past 11 years, Elena continued. "In addition, 3 businesses are paying twice to insure the same assets, because 2 policies were signed 4 months apart and no one ever compared them. And the logistics warehouse in Red Hook has had a broken drainage line since before I arrived here, one bad enough to damage inventory through 2 consecutive rainy seasons, while repairing it would cost less than the value of the goods lost in a single season." She paused long enough for the numbers to settle upon the table. "That isn't talent, ma'am. It's arithmetic. Anyone with patience and a pencil could do it." No one else bothered. Cordelia smiled very faintly, the kind of smile that touched no other part of her face. "And yet here you are, dining with us." "Because he invited me," Elena replied, "and because I've learned that a room filled with fine food and poor manners is still only a room in the end." Someone at the far end of the table drew in a breath. Silvio Ranieri laughed, louder than necessary, the laughter of a man trying to pull every eye in the room toward himself. "Well said," he remarked, for a little accountant. "Thank you," Elena replied. "I find it easier to speak well when I don't also have to lie." Silvio's smile stopped halfway and remained there for another second, like a door caught on its hinges. Then Dario Marchetti set his glass on the table. There was only a quiet click, so faint that no one should have noticed it, yet everyone at the table turned toward him. He didn't raise his voice. He had never needed to, and Elena had long since realized that this was what made the people around him fear him so deeply. "Miss Cerezi found $1,800,000 a year," he said, "money that 3 people sitting at this table should have found years ago, because that is precisely the work they're paid to do." He looked around the table slowly, one person at a time, and no one held his gaze for more than a second. "Let me remind everyone at this table of one thing," he continued. "Competence isn't increased by kinship, and incompetence isn't forgiven because of kinship." No one spoke. Cordelia Ranieri placed her hand on the stem of her glass, but didn't lift it. Then a hoarse voice came from the far end of the table, belonging to the elderly man Elena had never met, Emilio Grasso, whom she would learn much later was the most respected elder among everyone present that evening. He spoke only 2 words in Italian, murmuring them into his wineglass. "Ha ragione." She's right. Those 2 words fell upon the dinner table, and no one picked them up, but everyone heard them. And that table began to recalculate. Not the numbers. The standing of the woman of 27, seated 3 places away from the head of the house. The woman they had still believed, only 2 weeks earlier. It was a waitress brought home for some reason. No one considered proper to ask aloud. Elena didn't smile. She didn't look at Cordelia, didn't look at Silvio, and didn't seek Dario's eyes to see whether he was watching her. She merely picked up her fork and finished the food remaining on her plate, because her father had taught her that once the numbers had finished speaking, there was no need for anyone to add another word, and because she understood something no one else at that table understood that night. A victory at dinner meant nothing if, by tomorrow, she still hadn't proved where the missing money had gone. 3 nights after that dinner, Dario came to the study later than usual and didn't sit down in his chair. He stood beside the inner wall, where there was a cabinet door Elena had always assumed opened onto file storage, and she realized he had been standing there for some time before she finally looked up. "I need you to stay another half hour," he said. She set down her pen. He pulled open the cabinet door, and inside was a small safe built into the wall. He entered the combination, and got it wrong the first time. He stood motionless for several seconds, then tried again, more slowly, and this time, the safe opened. Elena said nothing. She understood that she was witnessing something this man had postponed for 2 years, and she understood that any words from her now would be unnecessary. There was no jewelry inside the safe, no money, no property documents, Nothing an ordinary person might keep in a family safe. There was only a thick file tied with a cloth ribbon and an envelope. Dario placed both on the long table, sat down, and pushed the file toward her. "Read it," he said. "You read numbers better than I do." Elena untied the ribbon. The first page was a plan, written in the same small, slanted, decisive handwriting she had seen in the margins of the old reports. The second page was a cost estimate. The third was a list of addresses in Brooklyn, with 3 lines crossed out and 1 circled. She read slowly, twice, just as she read everything. And halfway through the second reading, she had to stop for a moment to catch her breath. It was a plan for a center in Brooklyn, free of charge, open in the evenings and on weekends, intended for new immigrants. It wasn't a place that taught English. It wasn't a place that handed out food. It taught exactly 3 things: how to read an employment contract before signing it, how to examine a pay statement and determine whether money had been deducted that couldn't legally be taken, and how to read a hospital bill, how to question the hospital, how to know what insurance was required to cover and what it wasn't. In the margin of the second page, an additional sentence had been written in pencil, saying that most people who were cheated weren't cheated with words at all. They were cheated with documents they couldn't read. Elena placed her hand on the page and sat in silence. She thought of her father sitting at their kitchen table in Brooklyn with the ledgers of small shopkeepers, translating every line of a contract for people who were afraid to ask anyone else. She thought of the stack of bills on her own kitchen table, arranged by payment deadline, rather than by the date they had arrived. She had already priced out the space, Elena said. The rent for the first 2 years, the renovations, all of it. There's even a projected payroll for 4 employees. She simply hadn't signed the lease yet. Dario nodded once. "She showed it to me twice," he said. "The first time, I told her to wait until the following year. The second time, I told her it was more complicated than she realized, because if my name was behind it, people would ask where the money had come from." He paused. "She told me that was precisely why we had to do it. She said that if this house could never do a single thing it could speak of openly before anyone, then in the end, it was nothing more than a vault with people living inside it." He looked down at the file. "She wanted to pull this entire family into the light," he said. "I kept thinking it was something we could do years from now." Elena asked the question she had been holding in her mind for the past half hour. "Why did you wait until now to open it?" Dario didn't answer immediately. He looked at the cabinet door standing open against the wall, then looked at her. "Because now you're in this room," he said. Those words cost him something. Elena could see it in the way his jaw tightened after he spoke, in the way the hand resting on the table closed and then opened again. She reached across the table and placed her hand over the back of his. She didn't hold it. She merely rested her hand there and didn't draw it away. They sat like that for a while, and in that vast house, there wasn't a sound except the clock in the hallway. "I'm not going to say what I'm thinking," Dario said. "I'm not asking you to," Elena replied. "I know," he said. "That's why I nearly did." She withdrew her hand slowly, and neither of them said anything more about what had just passed between them. Dario stood, picked up his coat, and stopped before reaching the door. "Keep that file with you," he said. "When you've finished your work, I want you to tell me how much money it will take to build it." Then he left. Elena remained there alone with the papers of a woman she had never met, and for the first time since entering that house, she allowed herself to think of the future as something real. She thought she still had plenty of time. She thought that after this work was finished, after every number had been returned to its rightful place, there would still be an entire spring ahead of them to say all the things no one had yet spoken aloud. She had no idea that from that night forward, she had exactly 9 days left. On the second of those 9 days, Elena returned to the apartment in Astoria and knew at once that someone had been inside. It wasn't because anything had been disturbed. It was precisely because nothing had been disturbed. All 3 drawers in her bedroom had been closed, but they had been closed in order from top to bottom, and Elena had a habit of opening them from the bottom up, then pushing them all shut at once, a habit she had learned from her father, who always said that the bottom drawer was the last place anyone searched, so it had to be the first place you opened. She checked everything. Nothing was missing. The cash in the tin box was untouched. Her laptop was still where she had left it. Her notebook was in her bag, as it was every day. She stood in the middle of the room for a while, then did something another person in her circumstances might never have thought to do. She took out her phone and photographed every drawer and every cabinet door, recorded the time, then wrote 3 short lines in her notebook describing what she had seen when she opened the door. She didn't call the police because there was nothing to report. She didn't call Dario because she didn't yet know what she would say to him. The following day, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the dialysis center called to tell her that Teresa Soresi's appointments for that week had been canceled because of a system error and that they were trying to reschedule them. Elena stood in the hallway of the mansion, with one hand gripping the windowsill, and listened as the person on the other end apologized in the sincere voice of someone who truly didn't understand what was happening. 2 hours later, they called again. The appointments had been restored. Nothing was wrong. Everything was back to normal. Elena thanked them, ended the call, and stood there for a very long time. Nothing had been damaged. No one had been hurt. That was precisely what made it frightening. No one had to damage anything to let her know they could. That evening, when she arrived home, a bouquet of white flowers had been placed neatly on the floor outside the apartment door. There was no card, no sender's name. Elena didn't bring it inside. She didn't throw it away immediately either. She took a photograph, recorded the time, then carried the bouquet to the trash bin at the end of the shared hallway, went inside, and locked the door. Her mother was sitting at the kitchen table. She watched her daughter for a moment, then asked, "You're in some kind of trouble, aren't you?" Elena said no. Her new job was simply busy, and her mother shouldn't worry. Teresa Soresi nodded and asked nothing more. She poured her daughter a glass of water and said, "Eat something, then get some sleep." But when Elena turned to walk into her room, she heard her mother speak quietly behind her in Italian, saying that her father had stood exactly that way whenever he lied. Elena didn't turn around. She entered her room, closed the door, and sat on the floor with her back against it for about a minute. Then she stood and went to work. She didn't panic, because panic wasn't on the list of things she permitted herself to do. She did exactly what her father had taught her. She made another copy of everything she had reconstructed over the past 3 weeks, writing it all out by hand, dating the top of every page, and placing her initials at the bottom. She left the first copy in the study, locked inside a cabinet, because if she took everything away, they would know she was afraid. She kept the second copy on her person. The third, she carried to a bank in Queens the following morning and placed in a safe deposit box opened in her mother's name, along with a properly stamped signature card and opening date. The bank employee asked whether she wanted to add the name of an authorized person. She said no. From that day forward, Elena changed the way she worked. For 3 weeks, she had been searching only for where the money disappeared. Now she began searching for where the money went. Those were 2 different tasks, and the second was far more difficult. The money left the businesses disguised as legitimate expenses: consulting fees, equipment rentals, repairs, and transportation costs. Every payment had an invoice. Every invoice had a tax identification number, and every transaction had a company name attached to it. She traced each company in turn. The first was a supply company in Queens, with an address and a telephone number no one ever answered. It transferred most of its revenue to a consulting firm in New Jersey. That consulting firm transferred the money to a property management company registered in Delaware. That company transferred it again. 4 layers. Every layer was legal on paper. Every layer had complete documentation. And every layer left the next person a little more exhausted, cost them a few more days, and made them a little more likely to give up. Elena didn't give up. Near midnight on the 4th day, she reached the final layer and found the name of the beneficiary behind the entity receiving the money. She read the name. Then she read it again. Then she read it a 3rd time, slowly, 1 word at a time, as though reading it slowly enough might transform it into a different name: Silvio Ranieri. Elena sat motionless for a very long time. Then she closed the file, placed it in the cabinet, locked it, and told no one. She didn't tell Rosa. She didn't tell Nico. Most of all, she didn't tell the man who still came to that room every evening, because she knew exactly what would happen if she did. And because a woman with nothing in her hands didn't accuse a mob boss's own blood on the strength of a hunch, she needed something no one could dispute. She didn't have it yet. 7 days remained. 2 days later, Elena found a payment unlike anything she had uncovered in the previous 3 weeks. From the beginning, everything she had traced had followed the same rhythm: small, steady, patient amounts, withdrawn little by little over the years by someone who had time and was in no hurry at all. This payment was different. It was a lump sum, $250,000, paid all at once and entered in the books as a technical consulting fee for a renovation project for which she couldn't find a single drawing, contract, or inspection report. She followed it. It passed through the same 4 intermediary layers she had come to know by heart, the same companies, in the same order, and at the end, it didn't stop in an account, but continued outward to a small auto repair shop in New Jersey. Elena checked the business registration for the shop. It ceased operations 3 months after receiving the money, and the person whose name appeared on the registration never opened another business after that. She sat staring at the 2 dates on the page before her, the date the payment had been made, and the date she had seen in an archived newspaper while researching this family during her first week, the date everyone in this house knew but no one ever spoke aloud. 4 days. The money had been paid exactly 4 days before it. Elena set down her pen. She sat perfectly still, didn't rise, didn't pace, didn't open another file, because she understood that what had just appeared on her table was something that, once seen, could never be unseen. Then she did the only thing left to do. She checked. The family's accounting system kept login records, and no one had ever thought to erase them because login records weren't numbers, didn't appear in any report, and were something no one ever read. Elena opened the archives from 2 years earlier and scrolled backward. Serafina Marchetti's account appeared there, silent for months at a time except for a few brief logins each quarter, the familiar rhythm of someone who still reviewed the books out of habit. Then, on one particular day, that rhythm changed. 11 days before the date, no one in the house ever spoke aloud. Serafina Marchetti logged in shortly before 11 o'clock at night and remained in the system for more than 2 hours. 4 days later, she did the same thing again, then a third time. Elena opened the list of files accessed during those 3 sessions. There were 3 files. She read their names, and she didn't need to investigate further to know what she was looking at, because all 3 files lay open on the long table before her at that very moment. 3 sets of records she had pulled from cardboard boxes with her own hands, reconstructed from receipts with her own hands, and marked with circles around the discrepancies with her own hands. The woman who had sat in this chair before her had held these same pages and reached the exact place Elena had just reached. There was only one difference. She had reached it 2 years earlier, and 11 days after she began counting, someone paid out $250,000, and 4 days after that payment, she was gone. Elena placed both hands flat against the table. She kept them there, both of them, pressing down until they stopped trembling. She didn't cry. She sat in the room that had remained sealed for 2 years, and allowed the thought to travel its full course, slowly, all the way to the end. Serafina Marchetti hadn't died in an accident. She had died because she counted, and that meant what Elena held in her hands was no longer merely an 11-year theft. It was a murder. And in this house, at that moment, Elena was the only person still alive who knew it. Her next thought wasn't to find Dario. Her next thought was to picture with absolute precision what would happen if she did. She had spent dozens of evenings sitting with that man. She knew he wouldn't shout. She knew he would listen to everything, sit in silence, and rise to his feet. And she knew that within 10 minutes of his standing up, someone would leave this world. No court anywhere in America would ever record Serafina Marchetti's name in any case file, and that man would lose the last remaining part of himself. Elena wasn't someone who had the right to stop him from doing what he wanted to do. But she was the only person who could decide when he learned the truth, and she wouldn't give it to him until she had enough evidence to make that truth lead to a trial instead of a body. She needed the bank records from the 4th layer. She needed something that proved the dates beyond dispute. She didn't have it yet. She closed the file, copied everything she had just discovered onto a new sheet of paper, dated it, placed her initials at the bottom, and kept it on her person instead of locking it in the cabinet. That night, she didn't take her usual route home. The following morning, before the car arrived to collect her, she returned to the bank in Queens, asked to access the safe deposit box in her mother's name, and placed the page inside. The employee stamped the date on the access slip and handed her a copy. She folded it, tucked it into her wallet, and stepped out onto the street. 5 days remained. That afternoon, Elena asked Nico to let her out a few blocks from home because she wanted to walk, and she remained at the elevated Astoria Boulevard station to wait for a train she didn't actually need to take. She sat there because she needed 15 minutes without anyone watching her. A woman came and sat on the bench, leaving precisely the amount of space that courtesy required. She appeared to be in her late 40s, wore a dark coat, and didn't look at Elena when she spoke. "Miss Cerezi," she said. "My name is Catherine Doyle. I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Elena didn't stand. She kept her eyes on the tracks and asked whether Doyle intended to arrest her. Doyle said no, held out her credentials long enough for Elena to read them, then put them away. "We've been watching the Marchetti family for 6 years, she said. 6 years, 3 generations of agents assigned to the case, and we've never had anyone inside that house reading the very ledgers you're reading. Until now." Elena didn't respond. Doyle continued in the same, even voice of someone reciting a file she had memorized. "Your mother, Teresa, is 58 years old. She receives dialysis 3 times a week and is on the transplant waiting list. And with her blood type, the average wait in this region is measured in years, not months. I know exactly how much you paid in co-payments last year. I know your credit card balance to the nearest $1,000. And I have the agreement you signed 3 years ago, the one you still aren't permitted to mention in any interview." She turned and looked at Elena for the first time. "They once used paperwork to force you into silence, Miss Cerezi. I'm inviting you to speak." Elena asked what she wanted. Doyle answered concisely, like someone who had rehearsed the words many times. 6 months. You wear a recording device when you enter that house, and you continue doing exactly the work you're already doing, nothing more. In return, every cost of your mother's treatment will be covered during those 6 months and afterward, and your name will be removed from the list you know exists, even though no one has ever admitted it. You'll be able to return to your profession. A train thundered overhead, and both women fell silent until the noise had passed. Then Elena said no. Doyle didn't appear surprised. She only asked why. Elena sat straight, both hands resting on her knees, and spoke in the calmest voice she could still manage. "If you know about what happened 3 years ago, then you also know I followed the proper procedure," she said. "I wrote the report, dated it, and submitted it to my superiors. I gave the truth to the people I was told I was supposed to give it to. They took it away and arranged a settlement, and 3 weeks later, I was the one escorted out of the building." She paused. "It took me 3 years to understand my mistake. My mistake wasn't speaking. My mistake was giving the truth to someone else to hold for me. You're asking me to do exactly that a second time. The only difference is that this time, the person holding it wears a badge." "We aren't that accounting firm," Doyle said. "Perhaps not," Elena replied. "But if 6 months from now your superiors decide to change direction, or decide what I bring out isn't enough to build a case, the people left to live with the consequences will still be my mother and me, not you. This time, I'm holding it myself." Doyle studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "You understand that you're sitting inside a house where someone tried to kill its owner right in front of you?" "I understand," Elena said. "And I understand more clearly than you think." Doyle took out a business card. She didn't hand it to Elena, but placed it on the bench between them. "You'll call," she said. "Everyone does. Not today, not this week, but the time will come when you're holding something you won't dare leave in your own home overnight. When that happens, you'll call." Then she stood and walked away. Elena remained seated for a while longer. She picked up the card, read it, and slipped it into her wallet instead of throwing it away. Then she reached into her coat pocket and stopped the recording on her phone, the one she had started 3 seconds after the woman sat down. She hadn't turned it on because she distrusted Doyle. She had turned it on because her father had taught her that any conversation whose timing she hadn't chosen needed to be recorded, and because over the past 3 years, she had learned that words without a date attached could later be retold, however anyone pleased. When she arrived home, she copied the recording to 2 separate places, then wrote in her notebook the date, the time, the name of the person who had sat beside her, and the full contents of the offer Doyle had made, before placing her initials at the bottom of the page. She didn't know what she might need it for. She simply did what her father had taught her, and above her, on the stairs leading down to the platform, a man who had been leaning against the railing the entire time raised his phone, took 3 photographs of the 2 women sitting beside each other on the bench, then walked away before the next train could enter the station. Later, when Elena sat down and pieced everything together in the exact order it had happened, she understood that the bottle of wine that night had only been the first plan. It was simple, clean, and if it had succeeded, no one would have needed to ask any questions at all, because a man sitting alone on the anniversary of his wife's death could leave this world in many ways no one wished to examine too closely. That plan had failed, And it had failed because a 27-year-old waitress had taken the trouble to look closely at the seal around a bottle cap. The person behind it didn't try a second time. He moved on to the other plan, one that was slower, cleaner, and entirely legal. And because that plan required paperwork, the woman sitting inside that house reading the paperwork immediately became the first thing that had to be removed. Everything happened in the course of a single morning. At 9 o'clock, the attorney Julian Reese called, his voice urgent for the first time in years. A petition had been filed with the New York Surrogates Court, seeking to remove Dario Marchetti as trustee of the Marchetti Family Trust, the legitimate estate in which Bianca's inheritance was held. The petition cited 2 grounds. The first was the prolonged psychological collapse that had followed his wife's death 2 years earlier, supported by statements from family members claiming that he had sealed the deceased woman's study, refused to receive visitors, and neglected meetings. The second was reckless financial management, resulting in substantial losses. The person petitioning to be appointed as the replacement trustee was Silvio Ranieri. At 9:20, Reese continued reading from the supporting exhibits, and that was when Elena had to sit down. Every piece of evidence attached to the petition consisted of pages from her own analysis. The same presentation, the same order of columns, the same businesses. There was only one difference. Someone had altered the explanations, reversed every conclusion, and presented the discrepancies not as money removed from the books by the person keeping them, but as money squandered by the man in charge. 3 weeks she had spent in a room sealed for 2 years. 3 weeks adding up every stack of receipts, and all of it remained intact in those pages, except its point had been bent backward and aimed directly at the man she was trying to save. At 10 o'clock, the second piece of news arrived. Silvio Ranieri had called for a meeting before the council, citing the exact grounds contained in the petition and asking the other families to consider whether Dario Marchetti was still mentally fit to hold his position. It meant that the same story was being told twice, once before an American court and once before a court that existed in no book of law. And in both places, the storyteller was the same man. At 10:40 came the final thrust of the blade. 3 photographs were printed and placed in the hands of every person in the house. An elevated train platform, a bench, 2 women sitting beside each other, and everyone in that house recognized the woman on the right. No caption was necessary. They had already written the conclusion for themselves before they had even seen the photographs. A stranger had been brought into the house more than a month earlier. That stranger had read every ledger. Then the family's documents appeared in a court filing, and that same stranger was photographed, sitting on a bench speaking with a federal agent. Elena was standing in the study when 2 men came to the door. They didn't raise their voices. They merely told her she was being asked to come into the next room. She followed them. She didn't ask why, didn't say she was innocent, and didn't demand to see anyone. She had time to do only one thing before stepping through the doorway. She pushed the notebook in her hand deep into her coat pocket and fastened the button over it. The room they took her to wasn't locked. That was what Elena remembered most clearly about those hours. The door wasn't locked. Yet she remained seated in the chair because both sides understood that locking it would have been unnecessary. No one touched her. No one raised their voice. They simply left her sitting in a room with someone standing guard in the hallway and allowed time to finish the rest of the work. 3 hours. During those 3 hours, she heard footsteps moving back and forth outside the door, heard a telephone ringing somewhere downstairs, and once heard Cordelia Ranieri's voice carrying in from the hallway as she told someone that she had said so from the beginning, that people didn't bring a stranger into their home and open every drawer for her to inspect, and that now everyone could see the consequences. Elena didn't rise to argue. She sat still and made the only calculation that remained useful at that moment. She had the handwritten original, dated and initialed, prepared 3 weeks before the petition was filed. She had the recording of the conversation on the train platform, in which they could hear her refuse the offer in her own voice, and she had a sheet of paper inside a safe deposit box in Queens that, once brought into the light, would leave no path of retreat for anyone. Those 3 things were all she had, and all 3 were useless if the only man in that house with the authority to decide refused to sit down and listen to her. Outside the window, the light slowly faded. Then footsteps stopped before the door, and it opened. The man who entered was Dario Marchetti. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment before speaking. "You met with the FBI?" "Yes," Elena said. "You didn't tell me." "No." He waited. He didn't ask another question, didn't shout, didn't pace the room. He simply stood there and waited, and Elena understood that the silence itself was the question. Because if I'd told you, she replied, you would have had to make a decision about me that very night. And at that point, I didn't have enough in my hands for you to make the right one. I'd rather have you doubt me for a few more days than make the wrong decision because you didn't have all the facts. She rose, unfastened the button on her coat pocket, and took out her notebook. I have 3 things, she said. I'm going to give them to you in order, because the order matters. She placed the first one on the table. This is my handwritten copy, she said. Everything I reconstructed, with the date at the top of every page and my initials at the bottom. Compare the dates on these pages with the date Silvio filed his petition. They're 3 weeks apart. Mine came first. If someone took my work and altered it, they could only have done so afterward, never before. He picked it up, turned through several pages, then set it down. Next, she placed her phone on the table and pressed play. In the silence of the room, a woman's voice rose from the speaker, talking about 6 months, a recording device, and medical expenses. Then Elena's voice followed, saying no. She let the recording play all the way to the end without cutting a single word, including the part where the other woman said that everyone eventually called. When the recording stopped, Dario was still standing exactly where he had been. I wrote down the date, the time, and the entire conversation in my notebook that same night, she said. You can compare them. He stared at the phone on the table for a long time. And the third thing? He said. Elena didn't answer at once. It was the first time that evening she had hesitated, and he saw it. I've carried the third thing on me for 2 days, she said. I didn't give it to you, not because I don't trust you, but because I know exactly what you'll do in the first 10 minutes after you find out. Then she opened her notebook to the final page and laid it before him. There was a payment of $250,000, paid all at once, unlike any other payment made over those 11 years, she said. It passed through 4 layers of companies, then left the system and went to an auto repair shop in New Jersey that closed 3 months later. You can read the date of the payment for yourself. He read it. And I checked the login records for the accounting system, Elena continued. 11 days before that date, your wife began a review of her own. The 3 files she opened were the same 3 files I pulled out of the boxes during my first week here. She paused. Then she finished, slowly and clearly, because she knew she would never have to speak those words a second time. Your wife didn't die in an accident, sir. She died because she counted 2. Dario Marchetti didn't shout. He didn't strike the table with his hand, didn't call for anyone, didn't speak a single word for so long that Elena could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. He merely pulled out the nearest chair and sat down very slowly, the way a man sits when the bones have just been taken from his body. He lowered his head and placed both hands on the table, one on either side of the page, without touching it. For the past 2 years, he said, his voice roughening in a way she had never heard before, I thought the only thing I still owed my loyalty to was my grief. I sealed that room and called it devotion. He raised his eyes. It turns out I still owe her an answer. Elena said nothing. She had learned long ago that there were silences it would be an act of cruelty to fill. Then he asked her only one question, and it wasn't the one she had expected. Why didn't you leave? He said. You could have left last week. You knew someone in this house wanted me dead. You knew someone had entered your apartment. You had copies in your hands. You had my name in the ledgers. And you could have taken all of it to the woman on that train platform and traded it for a new life for yourself and your mother. Why didn't you go? Elena stood silently for a moment before answering. Because I left once before, she said. 3 years ago, I signed the paper they put in front of me, took the money, kept silent, and walked out of that building. She looked directly at him. I didn't like the person I became afterward. 3 years passed, and I still couldn't bring myself to like her. So this time, I stayed. Dario Marchetti remained seated in silence a little longer. Then he rose, closed the notebook, and placed it back in her hands instead of keeping it. You hold on to this, he said. It belongs to you. He walked to the door and opened it. Nico Sarto was standing in the hallway. Tell the council, Dario said. I'll attend the meeting. Nico nodded and turned away. Dario paused at the threshold without looking back at her. And tell everyone in this house that from this moment forward, anyone who touches Miss Cerezi will answer to me. The following morning, Dario told her she wouldn't be entering the meeting room. He said it in the voice of a man who had already made his decision and had no intention of discussing it further. Elena set down her coffee cup and said no. You need someone in that room who has actually read those ledgers, she said. Not someone who heard about them from another person. Not a lawyer reading a summary. Someone who added up every stack of receipts with her own hands. As of today, I'm the only person who did that who is still alive. They'll call you a waitress with a grudge against this family, he said. Then I'll bring the evidence of a waitress, Elena replied, and it'll still be far more than anything Silvio brings. Outside the door, Rosa Vitali laughed aloud, then hurried on her way, and Dario stared at the doorway for a moment before turning back and saying, "All right, you're coming with me." The sit-down took place at a social club in Bensonhurst on Wednesday afternoon. Presiding over it was Don Aldo Fenaroli, 71 years old. A man Nico told her during the drive had never once in his life been impressed by anyone's title. Don Emilio Grasso sat to his right. 3 other families sent representatives. Julian Reese sat off to the side with his court files, because the proceedings in Surrogate's court were moving forward at the same time and had nothing to do with what happened inside this room. Silvio Ranieri sat across from Dario. Marco Bellini sat 2 chairs away from him, silent, both hands resting on his thighs. Fenaroli read the charges in the even voice of a man reading official minutes, emphasizing nothing and omitting nothing. Elena sat at the far end of the table, and throughout the reading, she didn't watch Fenaroli, she watched Silvio. And what she saw sent a chill along her spine. He was completely calm, not the strained calm of a man struggling to conceal something, but the calm of someone who had calculated every step in advance, rehearsed his answer to every possible question, and was simply sitting there waiting for his turn. When Fenaroli finished, he set the paper down and turned to her. "Miss Ceresi," he said, "your name appears in this filing as the source of the figures now being used against Mr. Marchetti. What do you have to say?" Elena rose. She hadn't rehearsed a single word, because her father had once taught her that rehearsed truth sounded exactly like a lie, and she wanted this room to hear her in her own voice. "Sir, I have 2 things, she said. "Both can be independently verified this afternoon, and I'm not asking anyone to take my word for either one." She placed the first set of documents on the table. "These are printouts of the files submitted by the petitioner," she said, "and this is my handwritten copy. They contain the same information, but reach different conclusions. What matters isn't in the words. It's in the information attached to each electronic file, the part no one sees when they open it to read. Every file records the date it was created and the date it was last modified." She placed her finger on a highlighted line. "The files submitted by the petitioner were created 3 weeks after my handwritten version. Mine existed first. If my documents were copied and then altered, those alterations could only have been made after I wrote them. No one can alter something that doesn't yet exist." Fenaroli looked down at the page. "What else?" "There is one more point, sir," Elena said. "Each file also records the version of the software used to export it. These files were exported using a newer version, and that version wasn't released by the vendor until after the date printed on the documents themselves. That means the documents claim they were created on a date when the tool used to create them didn't yet exist. You can ask any independent technical expert to verify that in 20 minutes. The room fell silent. Silvio Ranieri's expression didn't change. "The second thing," Fenaroli said. Elena opened the second file. "This is the path the money followed," she said. "It left 14 businesses disguised as legitimate expenses, then passed through 4 layers of intermediary companies, 1 in Queens, 1 in New Jersey, and 2 registered in Delaware. Every layer had proper invoices. Every layer cost anyone following the trail several more days." She turned to the final page. At the 4th layer, the money stopped in a trust account. That account belongs to the law office representing the petitioner in the petition being discussed here this afternoon. Somewhere near the far end of the table, a chair shifted. "Where did you obtain these records?" Fenaroli asked. "From the receiving bank, sir," Elena replied. "I requested formal confirmation of the transactions through the proper procedure, acting as the person authorized by the owner of the originating account to conduct the review, and I have the authorization letter with me. I obtained them more than 2 weeks ago." She paused. "That means I had them in my possession before I knew I would need to use them. The date on the bank's confirmation letter proves it, and that date isn't something I could have written myself." At the other end of the table, Don Emilio Grasso gave a slight nod. Fenaroli looked at no one. He drew both sets of documents toward himself and slowly reread the sections Elena had indicated, without overlooking a single line. Then he removed his glasses, folded them, placed them on the table, and turned his head toward the left, where Marco Bellini had remained silent since the beginning of the meeting, both hands resting on his thighs. "Mr. Bellini," Fenaroli said, "you kept this family's books for 11 years. Explain to me why a document bearing your name was created with a tool that didn't yet exist on the date printed on it." Marco Bellini opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. 11 years of composure. 11 years of sitting at the far end of rooms like this one while no one even bothered to remember he was there. And all of it failed to survive a single question. Then he did the one thing a man in his position should never do. For the first time all afternoon, he turned his head toward Silvio Ranieri. Silvio was staring very carefully into the empty space before him. Everyone in the room saw it. "I was told this would never reach the council table," Bellini said. His voice was low and dry. "I was told the petition would be handled quietly in court, that no one would have to sit here, that it was only a matter of paperwork." "Who told you that, Mr. Bellini?" Fenaroli asked. The silence lasted a very long time. No one urged him on. Fenaroli merely sat there with his hands folded together and waited, and the weight of that waiting was heavier than any threat. Then Bellini spoke a name, flatly and without emotion, as though he were reading a line from an accounting statement. "Silvio Ranieri." Elena rose. She took the final sheet of paper from her bag, the one she had kept in a safe deposit box in Queens, and retrieved only that morning, and placed it on the table before Fenaroli. "Sir, there is one more payment," she said. $250,000, paid in a single transaction, passed through those same 4 layers of companies before leaving the system and reaching an auto repair shop in New Jersey that ceased operations 3 months later. She placed her finger on the final line. This payment was made 4 days before Mrs. Serafina Marchetti died, and 11 days before that payment, she herself opened an internal review of the 3 files I reconstructed during my first week in that house. The entire room turned as one. Silvio Ranieri rose to his feet. "I am blood of this family," he said, and for the first time all afternoon, his voice broke in the middle of a sentence. "I was sitting at this table before some of you were even here. Are you going to believe the word of a girl who carries plates over mine?" Fenaroli didn't raise his voice. He spoke in the same even tone he had used to read the official record. "At present, you are a man who forged documents and submitted them to a court in order to seize control of assets that didn't yet belong to you," he said. "And according to what has just been placed on this table, you paid for the death of the wife of a man sitting in this room. Consider your next words very carefully, Mr. Ranieri." Silvio had no words left. Fenaroli delivered the judgment briefly, without elaboration. Under their rules, a man who struck at someone within his own family belonged to the one he had wronged. His fate rested with Dario Marchetti, and the council would not interfere, whatever he chose. The entire room waited for a nod. Elena saw 2 men at the far end of the table sit a little straighter, and she saw Nico Sarto subtly shift his stance near the door. Dario Marchetti rose. He didn't look at Silvio. He stared for a moment at the empty stretch of table before him, then spoke, his voice as calm as ever. "Someone said something to me on the night they tried to kill me," he said. "She said she wouldn't finish me with a knife, but with the truth. At the time, I thought it was merely a bold declaration from someone who had nothing in her hands. I was wrong." He raised his eyes. "I won't finish him with a knife," he said. "I'll finish him with the truth. The entire file concerning that payment will be turned over to the authorities, along with Mr. Bellini's statement, and Silvio Ranieri will answer before a court of this country, publicly, on the record, with my wife's name written into it." A murmur moved through the room. Cordelia Ranieri sprang to her feet and shouted that he was disgracing his own blood, that no one in this family had ever done such a thing, and that if his father were still alive, he would never have allowed this to happen. Dario let her finish. Then he said, "My father wouldn't have allowed my wife to die either." Fenaroli looked around the table. "You understand what you are proposing?" he asked. "I do," Dario replied, "and I understand what it means for my position. So I will say this now, here, before all of you. As of today, I am withdrawing from every operation that doesn't appear in lawful books. I will retain the businesses that bear my name, and I will return everything else to those entitled to receive it. I am not asking anyone to keep my seat for me." The room fell completely silent. Then Don Emilio Grasso rose first, bracing both hands against the table to lift himself to his feet. Serafina Marchetti deserves to have her name written in a court record, he said, not to become a second body buried in silence. He sat down. The second person to rise was the representative of another family, then a third. Fenaroli didn't stand. He merely tapped the table twice, very softly, with his knuckles, and the sit-down was over. Marco Bellini was dismissed that very afternoon. 11 years of theft were recalculated down to the last cent, and Elena was the one who completed that final sum because no one else in the house had the patience to do it. Everything he still owned was applied against what he had taken. The remaining balance, which was more than a man like him could ever repay in the years he had left, was forgiven in exchange for a full sworn statement given in the presence of an attorney, a statement proving that the losses cited in the court filing hadn't been caused by the head of the family. He left the house through the back door with no one there to see him off, and Elena watched from the window. In the space of a single afternoon, the man had somehow become an old man. She felt no satisfaction, only a weary relief. The relief of seeing a column of numbers finally balance after 11 years of being forced to tell a lie. Silvio Ranieri was indicted for murder for hire, along with forging documents submitted to the court. The petition in Surrogate's court was withdrawn, and not a single dollar of Bianca's inheritance was disturbed. That evening, Dario found Elena in Serafina's study, where the records still covered the long table, the very place where everything had begun 5 months earlier. "You protected my sister's inheritance," he said. "You protected this estate, and you protected my name, something I had almost stopped believing was worth protecting." "I only kept careful records," Elena replied. "It was more than that," he said. He walked around the table and stopped before her, closer than either of them had allowed themselves to stand during the past 5 months. "I'm going to say something, and I hope you'll let me finish before telling me it isn't necessary." "I'm not promising anything," she said. "I love you," he said, plainly and without ornament. The way he said everything that truly mattered, not because of what you've done for this house, though I'm grateful for every column of numbers. I love you because of who you are when no one is asking anything of you. Steady, exact, and entirely your own. I want to marry you, Elena Soresi, not as a rescue, and not as a reward, but because for 2 years, I haven't wanted anything for myself, and I want this. She was silent for a long while. "I didn't come to this house to be saved," she said, "and I won't step into a life of safety unless it's one I choose for myself. But I've already chosen you. Not tonight. Months ago, if I'm being honest. I simply didn't have enough evidence then to prove it to myself." "Dario," he said, "if you're choosing me, begin by calling me by my name." "Dario," she said, and it was the first time she had ever spoken his name aloud. He took her hand, all of it, and held it between both of his. "There's a difference," she said softly, "between being given everything and finally being seen for exactly who you are. I've longed for the second one all my life. I didn't know I could have it until I walked into this house." 10 years later, on a street in Brooklyn, there stood a center bearing the name Serafina Marchetti. It opened in the evenings and on weekends, entirely free of charge, and taught newcomers to the country 3 things: how to read an employment contract before signing it, how to examine a paycheck and see whether anything had been deducted incorrectly, and how to read a hospital bill well enough to know which charges they were responsible for and which they weren't. It didn't teach people whom they should trust. It taught them how to count for themselves. Elena ran the center, and it was also the first official job she had held in years, one that came with health insurance in her own name. By the 3rd year, her mother received a kidney transplant through a paired donation program she had patiently waited to enter through 2 long winters. And she sat in the front row at her daughter's small wedding, crying from beginning to end, while refusing to admit she was crying at all. Bianca Marchetti, now 29, was a forensic auditor who taught the advanced class at the center every Thursday evening. Cordelia Ranieri attended the opening ceremony with her back as straight as ever, and offered Elena a private apology in the office, brief and without evasion. Elena accepted it calmly, without making a performance of it, because 10 years beside Dario had taught her that a person who was allowed to change was worth far more than one who had merely been defeated. Bellini died 3 winters ago, and left Elena a short letter thanking her for the mercy he hadn't believed he deserved. She kept it beside the first dated copy she had ever made. Late one afternoon, she and Dario stood by the window and watched the light slowly fade over the row of buildings. "Do you still think about that night?" he asked. "Often," she said. It isn't every day that a waitress threatens a mob boss and then marries him. He laughed, and there was no rust left in the sound now. You didn't finish me, he said. You began me. Elena Sorezi's story leaves us with a few very simple truths. A person's dignity doesn't lie in the title they carry, but in the moment they dare to speak, when they're the only one who can see the truth. The most admirable person in a room is often not the one who speaks the loudest, but the one willing to sit down and count carefully enough to get it right. And in life, revenge will always be the easier road, while choosing truth over anger is what makes a person decent. Above all, please remember that no one is nameless. The person carrying plates, the person sweeping the floor, the person standing behind the counter, every one of them carries a story and a value within them that we can see only when we're willing to stop and respect them long enough to look. If today's story touched you, please press the like button, share this video with the people you care about, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening to more compelling stories together every day. How did this story make you feel? And have you ever met an Elena in real life? Someone who quietly kept doing the right thing while no one noticed? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.